Hi, welcome to our channel where we share the most intriguing stories. When I inherited my family's century-old home, I thought it would be a peaceful escape. But the local HOA, led by the ruthless Karen Delaney, had other plans. From sabotage to an army of rats unleashed on my property, she turned my life into a nightmare. Little did she know, I wasn't going down without a fight. When I first walked through the creaking gate onto the land I'd inherited, I felt like I was stepping into a piece of living history. The house, weathered but proud, stood at the center of 6 acres of rolling greenery, bordered by towering oaks and patches of wildflowers that had likely been there since my great-grandfather planted them. It was more than just a house. It was a legacy, a gift passed down through generations, and now it was mine to protect. This place wasn't just a home, it was freedom. While the surrounding neighborhood had fallen under the grip of the local homeowners association, my property had remained an independent island in their sea of rules and regulations. I wasn't bound by their bylaws, their mandatory fees, or their endless obsession with aesthetic standards. For years, this house had stood as a reminder that not everyone had to fall in line, but freedom, I was learning, came with a price. It didn't take long for me to meet Karen Delaney, the iron-fisted president of the HOA. She arrived on my second day, uninvited and unapologetic, driving a gleaming white SUV that looked like it had never seen a dirt road. She stepped out, clipboard in hand, her heels clicking on the cracked pavement of my driveway, and gave me a smile so tight it looked like it hurt. "I'm Karen Delaney," she announced, extending a hand she clearly didn't expect me to shake. "President of the Forest Heights Homeowners Association, welcome to the neighborhood." "Thanks," I said, keeping my tone polite, "but I'm not part of the HOA. Her smile faltered for the briefest moment before returning with renewed force. "Well, that's something we should talk about. We value unity here in Forest Heights, and it's only natural that you'd want to align with our community standards." "I appreciate the offer," I replied, "but this land has been in my family for over a century. It's never been part of the HOA, and I plan to keep it that way." Karen's expression tightened. "Of course," she said, the edges of her voice sharpening. "But it's important to remember that everyone benefits when we all follow the same rules. Just something to think about." I didn't need to think about it. My family had worked too hard to keep this land free from the HOA's grip, and I wasn't about to give that up. But as Karen turned to leave, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end of our conversation. It was just the beginning. Karen didn't waste any time letting me know what she thought about my refusal to join her precious HOA. Within days of her visit, I started noticing small, irritating changes around my property. At first, it was little things. A notice taped to my door about overgrown vegetation or unauthorized renovations, even though I hadn't done anything except trim the hedges. Then my mailbox disappeared entirely. In its place was a printed flyer from the HOA suggesting I upgrade to a compliant mailbox design. It would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. I tried to brush it off, focusing on the endless list of projects that came with inheriting a 100-year-old home. The roof needed patching, the plumbing was temperamental, and the garden my grandmother had once cherished was overrun with weeds. It was hard, satisfying work, and for a while, it helped me forget Karen and her clipboard-wielding army. But Karen wasn't done. The notices became more frequent, and the accusations grew more bizarre. One morning, I found an envelope shoved under my door, claiming my property violated community aesthetic standards because of unsanctioned outdoor furniture. Another day, my trash bins vanished entirely, only to reappear a block away with a note advising me to use HOA-approved containers. Each incident was petty, calculated, and designed to wear me down. The tipping point came one night when I was jolted awake by a strange noise outside my window. It was a low, rustling sound, almost like static, followed by what I could only describe as faint scratching. Grabbing a flashlight, I stepped outside to investigate. What I saw stopped me in my tracks. Rats. Dozens of them scurrying across my lawn, gnawing at the garden fence, and disappearing into the shadows near my tool shed. The next morning, I surveyed the damage. Wires had been chewed clean through, my outdoor furniture was in tatters, and the plants I'd spent weeks reviving were destroyed. It wasn't just a nuisance. It was sabotage. I called in an exterminator who confirmed what I was beginning to suspect. "This wasn't natural," he said, holding up a small bait box he'd found near the edge of my property. "Someone put this here to attract them." My blood boiled as I realized the truth. This was Karen's doing, or at least someone working on her behalf. It had her fingerprints all over it. I remembered the smug look on her face during our last conversation, her thinly veiled threats disguised as friendly advice. She was trying to break me, to make me cave to her rules, and she wasn't above using vermin to do it. But if Karen thought rats were going to scare me off, she'd underestimated just how stubborn I could be. I spent the rest of the day clearing out the wreckage, replacing chewed wires, and setting traps. Then I went a step further. I installed a series of motion-activated cameras around the property, covering every angle I could think of. If Karen or her cronies set foot on my land again, I'd catch them in the act. 2 nights later, the cameras paid off. I woke up to an alert on my phone and checked the feed to see a group of figures moving along the property line. They were carrying large boxes and scattering something along the edges of my yard. My stomach turned as I realized they were planting more bait. I called the police, my hands shaking with a mix of rage and adrenaline. When the officers arrived, the culprits were long gone, but the evidence they left behind was damning. The bait boxes matched the one the exterminator had found, and my cameras had captured clear footage of the intruders. Though their faces were obscured, one figure stood out, Karen's unmistakable posture, clipboard in hand. The next morning, I confronted her. "Sorry, sir." She denied everything, of course, flashing me a smile so insincere it made my skin crawl. "Oh dear," she said, feigning concern. "You really should look into pest control. Rats can be such a nuisance." It took every ounce of self-control not to explode right then and there, but I knew better than to lose my cool. Karen had declared war, and now I had the evidence to fight back. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. Karen's smug denial only fueled my determination to fight back. She might have thought she was untouchable, but I wasn't going to let her destroy my home or my family's legacy without a battle. With the footage from my cameras and the bait boxes as evidence, I went straight to the police. While they were sympathetic, they warned me that without clear identification of the individuals, it might be hard to press charges. Karen was careful, but I was about to be even more so. I doubled down on my efforts. I upgraded my cameras, adding higher resolution and better angles, and placed hidden sensors around the property. Every time Karen or her associates approached, I'd know. Meanwhile, I began meticulously documenting every incident. Every notice, every disappearance, every piece of sabotage. My file grew thicker by the day, and so did my resolve. It wasn't long before Karen and her cronies struck again. Late one night, I received an alert from the cameras. This time, they were more brazen. The footage showed a small group sneaking onto my property, carrying not only bait boxes, but what appeared to be cages. My stomach churned as I watched them release live rats onto my land, their movements hurried but deliberate. Karen was among them, her clipboard tucked under one arm as she gestured and gave orders. The next morning, I woke up to another scene of devastation. The rats had chewed through more wiring, shredded the few remaining plants in my garden, and left droppings everywhere. My tool shed was a disaster, with insulation torn apart and nests forming in the corners. But this time, I wasn't just angry. I was ready. I took the new footage to my lawyer, who assured me we had a solid case. The clear images of Karen directing the sabotage were damning, and with the bait boxes and the exterminator's testimony, we had enough to take her to court. Still, Karen wasn't going to make it easy. As news of the escalating feud spread, Karen shifted her tactics. She began spreading rumors about me among the neighbors, accusing me of being reckless and a danger to the community. HOA members started treating me like a pariah, and I noticed more than a few disapproving glares whenever I walked through the neighborhood. She was trying to isolate me, to turn the community against me. But what Karen didn't realize was that a few of those neighbors were starting to see through her facade. Quietly, they began reaching out, sharing stories of their own experiences with Karen's tyranny. One couple confessed that they had been fined repeatedly for trivial violations, while another admitted that they'd been forced to make expensive changes to their home just to avoid her wrath. It wasn't much, but their support gave me the extra push I needed to keep going. I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was standing up to a bully who had controlled this community for far too long. Armed with evidence and newfound allies, I knew the time had come to bring Karen to justice. The battle for my land wasn't over, but for the first time, I felt like I might actually win. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs as I stepped inside, carrying the weight of months of sabotage, frustration, and determination. This wasn't just a fight for my land anymore. It was about holding Karen accountable for everything she had done, not just to me, but to the entire neighborhood. I wasn't the only one tired of her reign of control and intimidation. Today, justice would finally catch up with her. Karen arrived flanked by her attorney, as smug as ever. Though there was a flicker of unease in her carefully maintained demeanor, she clutched her clipboard like a shield, as if it could protect her from the mountain of evidence I'd prepared. Her attorney whispered something to her, but she barely acknowledged him, her gaze fixed forward, cold and unyielding. The trial began with my lawyer presenting our case in painstaking detail. He laid out the timeline of incidents, starting with the petty notices and missing mailbox, escalating to the sabotage with rats and the destruction of my property. The security footage was the centerpiece of our argument. Clip after clip played for the court, showing Karen and her associates sneaking onto my land, carrying bait boxes, and releasing rats into my yard. Each video was a blow to her credibility, and I could feel the mood in the room shifting as the evidence piled up. Karen's attorney tried to dismiss the footage, claiming it was circumstantial and that Karen had been conducting routine inspections of the neighborhood. But my lawyer wasn't about to let that slide. He held up one of the bait boxes retrieved from my property and pointed out the specific type of commercial bait it contained. It was the same kind used by pest control companies, far from something an HOA president would need for inspections. The real turning point came when my lawyer called an exterminator to the stand. He testified that the infestation wasn't natural, pointing to the bait boxes and the deliberate placement of attractants around my property. His words were clear and damning. This was an intentional act of sabotage. As the case unfolded, more evidence came to light. A forensic accountant revealed discrepancies in the HOA's financial records, showing that Karen had diverted funds for personal use, including the purchase of pest control materials and other supplies unrelated to HOA business. The documents traced these purchases directly to Karen, painting a picture of not just harassment, but calculated misuse of power. When it was Karen's turn to take the stand, her confidence began to crumble. My lawyer grilled her relentlessly, forcing her to explain why she was present in the security footage and why HOA funds had been used to buy bait boxes. Her answers were evasive at best, outright lies at worst. The judge's sharp gaze never left her, and the tension in the room was palpable. Several neighbors testified as well, adding to the mounting pressure against her. Some spoke of their own experiences with Karen's authoritarian rule, fines for trivial infractions, threats for questioning her authority, and forced compliance with her ever-changing standards. One brave neighbor admitted overhearing Karen boast about teaching me a lesson after I refused to join the HOA. By the time the closing arguments were made, the case against Karen was airtight. My lawyer emphasized the deliberate and malicious nature of her actions, calling her behavior not just unethical, but criminal. Karen's attorney, clearly outmatched, could do little more than make weak appeals to her supposed dedication to the community. The judge took little time to deliver the verdict. The court finds the defendant, Karen Delaney, guilty of trespassing, property damage, and misuse of funds. The evidence presented clearly demonstrates an intentional effort to harass and harm the plaintiff. Ms. Delaney, your actions were not only illegal, but a gross abuse of your position. You are hereby sentenced to 5 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution for all damages. The room fell silent as the judge's gavel struck. Karen's face, once so smug and defiant, was pale with shock. The bailiff approached to escort her out, and for the first time she looked vulnerable, clutching her clipboard like it could somehow save her. It couldn't. As Karen was led away in handcuffs, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. This wasn't just my victory. It was a victory for everyone who had suffered under her rule. The neighborhood could finally breathe again, free from her tyranny. I walked out of the courtroom that day, knowing that justice had been served. The battle for my land, my home, and my family's legacy was over, and I had won. But more than that, I had proven that no one, not even Karen, was above accountability. Walking out of the courthouse that day, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The weight that had pressed down on me for months was finally gone. Karen was no longer a threat, not to me or to the neighborhood. Justice had been served, and the neighborhood was free from her grip. The battle had been exhausting, but in the end, it was worth every sleepless night and every moment of doubt. The aftermath of Karen's conviction sent shockwaves through the community. The HOA crumbled almost immediately, its reputation irreparably damaged. Many members, once loyal to Karen out of fear or convenience, were quick to distance themselves from her and the association. Meetings were canceled, fines were rescinded, and the rigid rules that had governed the neighborhood dissolved overnight. But while the neighborhood began to rebuild itself, I turned my focus to restoring my home and land. The compensation ordered by the court covered much of the damage, but the process of undoing months of sabotage was still daunting. The garden was my first priority. I cleared the debris, replaced the chewed wires, and replanted the flowers and shrubs that had been destroyed. Slowly, the property began to resemble the sanctuary it once was. Neighbors who had once been silent started to approach me, some offering apologies, others lending a hand. "We should have spoken up sooner," one elderly man admitted as he helped me replant a tree. "Karen made us all afraid, but you showed us we didn't have to be." Their support was unexpected, but appreciated. While I hadn't fought this battle for anyone but myself, it was gratifying to know that others felt liberated by Karen's downfall. The neighborhood began to transform. Instead of a place ruled by fear and fines, it became one of collaboration and community. People started organizing voluntary cleanup days and block parties, creating a sense of unity that had been missing for years. For me, though, the greatest reward was seeing my land restored. The oak tree stood tall and proud, a testament to resilience. My garden flourished again, the wildflowers blooming in vibrant colors. I installed new outdoor furniture, upgraded my security system, and added finishing touches that made the house truly feel like my home. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the yard basked in golden light, I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and let the peace settle over me. The land had weathered storms before, both literal and figurative, and it would continue to stand strong, just like my family had. The neighborhood, now free of Karen's tyranny, began to flourish in its own way. It was quieter, friendlier, and lighter than it had been in years. For the first time in what felt like forever, I could finally enjoy the peace I had fought so hard to protect. This land, my family's legacy, was safe. And so was I. In the months that followed Karen's downfall, the neighborhood underwent a transformation. Without the rigid grip of the HOA dictating every aspect of life, the community felt freer, like a weight had been lifted. People began to smile more, stop to chat, and even wave at each other in ways I hadn't seen before. It was as if a collective exhale had swept through the area, leaving room for something better. For me, the changes were just as profound. My property, once a battlefield, was now my sanctuary again. I dedicated my time to restoring every inch of the land, making sure it reflected not only the legacy of my family, but also the resilience it took to protect it. The garden, which had been ravaged by Karen's sabotage, was now vibrant with life. Flowers bloomed in a riot of colors, and the air was filled with the earthy scent of freshly tilled soil. The oak tree, that towering symbol of endurance, stood strong as ever, its branches swaying gently in the breeze. The neighborhood, too, seemed to be thriving in Karen's absence. Where once there had been fear and resentment, there was now cooperation. Former HOA members, once silent enforcers of Karen's will, reached out to me with apologies. Some even offered to help with repairs around my property, eager to distance themselves from her tyranny. One neighbor, a quiet older woman who had been fined countless times for her garden design, approached me with seedlings from her own plants. "Your garden deserves this," she said, her voice soft but sincere. Without the HOA, residents began working together on their own terms. Voluntary cleanup efforts replaced mandatory rules, and block parties took the place of HOA meetings. A community that had once been fractured by Karen's authoritarianism was beginning to rebuild itself, not through force, but through mutual respect and collaboration. Despite the newfound friendliness, I kept my boundaries intact. My home and land were deeply personal, a sacred space that I had fought tooth and nail to preserve. I welcomed neighbors when they stopped by for a chat or to lend a hand, but I made it clear that this land was my own. It wasn't just property, it was a piece of my family's history, and I wasn't going to let anything jeopardize it again. One evening, as I sat on the porch watching the sun dip behind the oak tree, I felt a deep sense of peace. The chaos Karen had brought into my life was now a distant memory, her name mentioned only in hushed tones as a cautionary tale. My home, my sanctuary, was finally free from her shadow. As the stars began to appear in the sky, I reflected on everything that had happened. The battle had been grueling, but it had taught me something invaluable. Standing up for what's right, no matter how difficult, is always worth it. This land wasn't just a testament to my family's resilience, it was now a symbol of my own. The wind rustled through the branches of the oak tree as if to remind me of its steadfast presence. The land was whole again, and so was I. And for the first time in what felt like forever, the future looked as bright as the stars shining above.